From the European Parliament here in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thank you for joining us tonight, and this is what we have for you on the menu. Fall of Merkel. The German Chancellor steps down as party chief and says she'll quit politics in 2021. Strong men rising. What Brazil's brash and controversial president-elect means for a global trend. Growing hate as the U.S. mourns a shocking attack. We'll look at the state of anti-Semitism in Europe. Brexit budget. As the UK government lays out its spending plans, it's exactly 5 months before divorce day. And Fab 4. How's this for an awkward political photo op? All right, it's time to meet our panel for tonight. We have Darren McCaffrey, of course, our political editor at Euronews. Darren, which of these stories do you like?
Well, I think it's in some ways the most concerning, which is that on the continent that saw the Holocaust, Tess, Jewish people are concerned again at the rising tide of anti-Semitism, the worst in decades. Many have already left the continent. As one historian put it, Europe's back in a very bad place.
Indeed. A lot of people following this story. All right, joining us tonight also is Florian Eder. He's the author of the Brussels Playbook. You might know this at Politico. Florian, which one are you watching tonight?
I think I picked Merkel's fall. It's the biggest surprise of the day, political surprise of the day, I'd say.
A big surprise indeed. Well, is it not? All right, joining us also is Esther Zalin. She's a reporter for the EU Observer. She's writing about Brexit and populism. Esther, good to see you again. Which of these stories are you watching?
I'm going to go with the elections in Brazil. I think it's a tectonic shift in world politics and also confirms a worrying trend of far-right leaders winning elections all over the world.
Indeed, we're seeing it not just in Europe for sure. All right, more on all of these stories. But first, we have our top story, what Angela Merkel is calling a clear signal today after 2 devastating setbacks in 2 German states in just 2 weeks. The German Chancellor is calling it quits. After nearly 2 decades as head of her party and 13 as her country's leader, Merkel says her political career will soon be ending.
Erstens. Auf dem nächsten Bundesparteitag der CDU im Dezember in Hamburg werde ich nicht wieder für das Amt der Vorsitzenden der CDU Deutschlands kandidieren. Zweitens, diese 4. Amtszeit ist meine letzte als Bundeskanzlerin der Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Bei der Bundestagswahl 2021 werde ich nicht wieder als Kanzlerkandidatin der Union antreten und auch nicht mehr für den Deutschen Bundestag kandidieren und das will ich nur zu Protokoll geben, auch keine weiteren politischen Ämter anstreben.
This after 2 major setbacks for Merkel. In Hesse yesterday, her Christian Democrats won just 27% of the vote in preliminary results, down more than 11 percentage points from 2013. And 2 weeks ago in Bavaria, Merkel's sister party suffered a huge blow in that state, losing more than 10 percentage points. All right, let's discuss this, of course. Let's take a wider look at how support for Germany's parties have shifted. Now, Merkel, is it the end? I will start with you, Florian. Is it the end of an era? You said this was a surprise.
Well, it is the end of an era, of course. You said it before. She's been Chancellor for 13 years. She's been at the head of the CDU, her party, for the last 18 years. It's, of course, the end of an era. It's surprising that it happened today. Of course, Merkel is not immune against the inevitable that after 2 losses and 2 election defeats, as you just described, it is, of course, time to draw consequences, even for her.
Yeah, it did seem that for a very long time she was invincible. She was really very much at power. When did it start going wrong for her?
Well, politically, probably in 2015, when the controversial decision was made to allow refugees into Germany. But I think this decision of hers today also buys her time in a lot of ways, very characteristically a Merkelite decision, because it gives her time to focus on the chancellery and perhaps finish whatever she started and leave a legacy that she would want to leave behind.
Yeah, but what does a Europe without Merkel look like? I mean, we've seen her...
This is the thing, because we haven't been used to it for a long time. As you were saying, she got elected to the CDU chair in 2000. This continent had only just started using the euro. Jacques Chirac was the president of France. In 2005, when she became chancellor, we weren't using iPhones. They didn't exist. No one had heard of Facebook, really. And Tony Blair was still the UK Prime Minister. She's been around for so long. And irrespective of whatever you think this, and it is the beginning of the end, she's been a rock of stability and a steady hand on the tiller, not just of Germany, but of the European Union. And this place, there's definitely a sense of apprehension, because when you look around, who's going to fulfill that role? Well, it may be who takes over from Angela Merkel. The guiding light that was meant to be Emmanuel Macron, well, he simply has not stepped up to that plate.
Yeah, and indeed, we're looking at a lot of these shifts already. So we're looking at what shifted for Germany's parties. Support for the CDU and the CSU has fallen from 40% in 2015 to 25% in 2018. The SPD has gone from 24 to 14%. The Greens have gone from 10% in 2015 to 19% now, while the AfD has shot from 6 to 16%. And AfD leader Alice Weidel tweeted after the vote in Hesse yesterday, saying the AfD is now firmly established in the German electorate, here to stay. Florian, AfD, they've really gotten a foothold. Do you see them as a legitimate party that's going to keep growing in Germany?
The other thing is, just to add on what you just said, the AfD wasn't around in 2005,
Yes.
let alone in 2000. They started off as a Euro critic party, being critical of the common of the Eurozone. Of course, in the past years and since 2015 in particular, they shifted even more to the far right, being a very hard migration critic party. Of course, that has changed the whole spectrum of German politics, and then this rise of the Greens is something rather new. We didn't see that last year in last year's elections. Of course, they did well, but the results that they had now in Bavaria 2 weeks ago and in Hesse last week are really kind of as if the pendulum swung back somehow.
Yeah.
As if people in both camps were disappointed by the CDU. They lost votes to the far right. They also lost votes to the more centrist forces, like the Greens are portraying themselves, at least successfully at the moment.
And that's slightly the problem, is that this is certainly not just about Angela Merkel. It's not as if, Angela Merkel's going to step back from the scene and everyone's going to rediscover what they loved about the CDU. As you were pointing out, in both Bavaria and in Hesse, they have lost votes to both the right and if we're going to put the Greens slightly on the left, to the left. So that means, where does the party then go? Because it's seeping support on two very different angles. And that's the question, and that's the trouble for the party. It's not just who should succeed Angela Merkel, is in what direction to this party, which has been one of the most successful political parties in Europe, where does it go next?
Yeah, and
that's interesting because already at EU level, the CDU as well as the EPP, its larger European family, is struggling with the exact same question: where to go? Should we go toward the right to get back the votes from AfD, or should we hold the center and open up to leftist
So without
voters?
Angela Merkel now, maybe is this a chance to steer Europe in another direction? I don't know.
I would start in Germany, if you ask me. And that very question is, of course, the question that the CDU has to ask itself: who to pick for to be the successor of Angela Merkel? Is it a candidate very close to her, more or less, more of the same?
More the same.
Or is it someone like Jens Spahn, who put forward his candidacy already this morning, Germany's health minister,
what do you reckon?
Who's been an outspoken Merkel critic? It's really too early to tell today, because that debate will take another few weeks, and we'll know the answer on December 4th.
While this is happening on the political level, obviously it's the people who were essentially leading the change in Germany. So let's find out what Germans are actually really feeling and thinking on the ground. For more on that, we have Alex in the Cube in Lyon. Alex, what do you have for us?
Well, Tess, have a look at this. From Jacques Chirac to Emmanuel Macron, from President Obama to President Donald Trump. Other leaders have risen and fallen. The world has changed. We've gone from the financial crisis to the migration crisis, momentous events sweeping the continent. And Merkel has been a central figure, hasn't she, all the way through. But now we have an end date. And for many people, she was called Mutti, mother in Germany. Other people called her the Queen of Europe. So now the questions actually are going beyond just what Germans are saying to what Europeans are saying. What does this mean for the whole of Europe? Well, let me just start off by focusing in on Germany. Matthew Goodwin pointing out that over the last 4 years, the AfD have risen. Now the Greens are on the rise. So we've gone from this near certainty of a Merkel-led country to what next, he asks here. Where next for German politics? And actually, if we're leaving Germany, we're going away from the continent and to Britain. Leave.eu, who are, of course, the Brexit-backing group, they point out Merkel, she's going. Macron, another very fond of the European Union here, seen as a leading light potentially, he's weak, whereas Salvini, Eurosceptic, is strong. Orban is defiant. They are saying Merkel's exit is part of the collapse of the European project. Of course, that is, they have an ideological horse in that race, shall we say. But when people talk about her legacy, what does it mean? Well, Michael Heaver, one of many, saying the legacy of Cameron in the UK was the rise of UKIP and Brexit. So for him, Merkel's legacy is the rise of the AfD after the migration problems. Then we have other people pointing out, like Mehdi Hassan, who praises her, takes an opposite view on the migration issue, praises her, but says, do not forget Greece. Do not forget Germany's role in imposing austerity on Greece. See what I mean here about this being a discussion, not just about Angela Merkel's role within Germany, but the role she's had in shaping the continent as it is now. And one interesting person, Alberto here, is the Europe editor for BuzzFeed News, saying perhaps her most important legacy, if we are going to talk about Germany, is making the CDU, moving it to the centre of politics, and saying her decision today is in it trying to protect that legacy. But he's saying here how fragile it is. So again, a lot of people on social asking, will Merkel last as long as the end date she's given herself? And unfortunately, that's a question I can't quite answer this afternoon, Tessa.
Thank you for that, Alex and our team in the Cube. All right, before that, we were talking about Europe's direction. Where do you think that was headed?
Well, I think this is going to be the challenge that's going to face whoever takes over. Now, you will know more about this than I will. And my sense is I cannot see how Angela Merkel will be Chancellor in 2021. I mean, surely when you start the train of I'm leaving office, people start to circle. Crises become much more difficult, and your authority simply seeps away. You know, in the United States, they call you a lame duck president. I would have thought that will happen here with Angela Merkel.
Well, she said for years that for that very reason, she would never separate the two offices, you know, her party office and the chancellery. Now, she's had second thoughts, of course, for good reasons. But of course, she's very well aware, and she said it in her press conference this morning, that this will weaken to a certain extent her authority and that it might become more difficult. Now, I think, again, depending on who is going to be her successor in the party chairmanship, that can be more smoothly in some cases than in others. If there's somebody like Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who's very close to her, is very similar in style, you can imagine that the two of them get along very well. In other circumstances, that could be very difficult indeed for the Chancellor, to get the grasp of her own party, basically.
And it might take actually a long time for CDU to figure out which direction to go, as we discussed before.
Absolutely. I mean, this is indeed the end of an era here, but then we're going to go to a beginning of a new era, because there's another election that's making global headlines. We're going to go to Brazil. That's the far right's Jair Bolsonaro is the new president-elect. And Brazilians celebrated as Bolsonaro won 55.2% of the vote. The former army captain campaigned to fight corruption, but became known for his controversial views. He has expressed nostalgia for the country's past military dictatorship, and he also said that women should not be treated equally at work because they take maternity leave, and that gay people who move into his building lower property prices. Bolsonaro joins a club of nationalist so-called strongman leaders. There's Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Hungary's Viktor Orban, Russia's Vladimir Putin, of course, and some would even argue U.S. President Donald Trump. All right. Well, we have a new guest. Bruno, you're writer for the Telegraph, if I'm not mistaken.
Times.
I'm sorry, The Times. You have Bruno Waterfield joining us for this panel. All right, let's start with you. The rise of strongmen, Bruno. Do you see this? Do you see this as a trend, a proper trend going around in the world?
I see as a trend people getting very upset about the election of certain types of leaders. And election's a key word here, as being some part of a trend towards strong men, towards dictators, the 1930s, and all the rest of it. But I do think you need to separate them out. I mean, Putin goes, way back. He's a product of a country and a constitution like Russia. Orban goes back a little way as well. Trump is, elected the American president in the home of democracy, land of the free, and all of that kind of stuff. Orban's repeatedly won landslide elections. So sometimes I think when people get worried about this, they're more worried, I think, about the majorities who elect these strong men, rather than the actual men themselves.
Is this a protest vote that we're seeing, or do people actually like what they're saying?
Well, let me just jump in, because Orbán did win 3 consecutive elections, but the second 2 elections were at least questionable, because he redrawn the election law, and even the OSCE, international observers, said the elections is free but not fair. So once you're elected, of course, with such a large majority, you can tweak the laws to your advantage. And I think that's more of the problem. It's not the problem that majorities express their opinion and they might be fed up and they want something completely different from the establishment.
So which is it?
It's just that these populist parties cannot tolerate dissent or opposing views. So their inclination is to curb democracy, courts, media freedom. So this is a trend that will not stop at elections, but could lead to the erosion of democracy.
Yeah, and what do you think, Dan?
I think fundamentally, there is an awful lot of, I think, particularly members of the elite, or indeed some people on the left, who struggle to come to terms with that actually people may well like what they hear from people like Donald Trump and from Viktor Orban and others, that they genuinely support them, that in an age of uncertainties we keep talking about, but in an age of change with migration technology, that actually they do want an era of stability and someone who maybe evokes a sense, an emotional sense of the glories of the past, that people freely go out and vote for that. That is not to say, there are clearly problems with manipulation, and it is interesting that we thought 10 years ago during the Arab Spring, for example, technology was going to free people and actually democratise everyone, and actually what it's done is become an instrument for the state to suppress people even more to a degree. But I did speak to Nina Schick. She is a political pollster. She's looking into this issue and has followed it for the last couple of years. And I started by asking her, look, why now? Why has this sudden trend begun now? Let's have a listen.
Reasons we see this is that it is not the cause, but it is the symptom. And the symptom is that the kind of world order that was built in the ashes of World War II, where the United States, was almost the global policeman and had its kind of values of liberal democracy and capitalism, that narrative that liberal democracy and capitalism went hand in hand, particularly was, made stronger after the Soviet Union collapsed. But what we're seeing now is that is not necessarily the end place of history, and that certainly democracy itself is being questioned. You see a lot of discontent across all the kind of liberal democracies in the world. There's a lot of mistrust in the institutions, the very fundamental processes, and this at a time, of course, when technology is completely reshaping geopolitics and the world.
What ties all these so-called strongmen together? I mean, should we be putting people like Donald Trump in the same basket as Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban and Duterte in the Philippines? What other kind of common traits, so to speak?
I think the common traits that they have is that they talk about a past, a past that was better, and somebody has taken that past away from them. So there always needs to be an enemy. This is a politics that is highly emotional, with someone to blame, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's migrants, whether it's whoever you like, there's always somebody to blame.
Is this a trend that we're likely to see continue, or is this just the natural kind of swing of politics that happens every generation or so?
I think certainly it's a trend that we'll see continue. I wouldn't say that that's cause for despair, although I do think that now, at this juncture in particular, we are seeing a tectonic shift in global politics. And I think part of the reason for that is because of the technological advancements that we see all around us. For the first time in human history, billions of people of the world are connected via networks on a thing in their hand, which is a phone. So the state, which has always been the arbiter of power, be it through its monopoly on information, its monopoly on being able to wage war, that has fundamentally shifted.
Yeah, she's talking about their, looking back at the past, this macho leadership, aggressive leadership that seemed to appeal to people. And I was also reading that the campaign, the way they do it is they campaign with such strong rhetoric, and then once they're elected, they kind of pull back. Do you see that as a strategy of strongmen leaders?
Well, I'm not sure I completely buy the idea of strong men leaders. I'm suspicious of it because of the kind of people who talk. It's one of those things that just makes me instinctively itchy. And we've got to remember that the liberal world order from 1935 on is often lent on dictators. The Brazilian military dictatorship between 64 and 85 was supported by the Americans, and everyone was quite happy about it. Markets are rather happy about Bolsonaro as well, because they think he might be liberal economically, even if he's a bit of a bigot. I'm not quite sure how that really works out. I think that the appeal to the past is something that's actually quite important, and it's something that people need to consider, because a lot of people do feel that certainly the institutions of state, of public authority, the economy themselves no longer represents them, no longer follows the patterns of their lives. And so in that sense, people might say, well, actually, over the last 20 years, things have got worse. I don't think that's something that can be automatically discounted and turned into a new sort of demonisation of voters. Because I think sometimes, again, you have to look at the specifics. Sometimes people have got a point. Even right-wing conservative people, there are a lot of them in Europe, but not a lot of their leaders really speak like them anymore.
I just add to that, and that's why I build into that. I think we're only starting to realise now the full consequences of the 2008 crash, which actually for a long time we didn't, and that, you know, there is that clearly effect that people feel that the world that they live in today, the increasing prosperity that they thought was the natural course of things, has not been reflected for many of them over the last 10 years.
Go ahead, I'll give you the last word.
I think it was very interesting what Nina said, that there is this loss of faith in that democracy can deliver, and the financial crisis and all these controversies within the liberal world order should be addressed and criticized.
And therefore brought into the mix. Yeah, there's a lot of things that go into why strong men we're seeing as a trend around the world. All right, now let's turn our attention to Ireland, because it's just re-elected President Michael D. Higgins with 56% of the vote. The politician who moonlights as a poet is today's You Said It.
This is a time to be active rather than passive, and clear choices are opening up as to what will be the character of our Irishness. Will it be a commitment to inclusion in a shared world, or a retreat to the misery of an extreme individualism? The people have made a choice as to which version of Irishness they want reflected at home and abroad. It is the making of hope they wish to share, rather than the experience of any exploitation of division or fear.
Quite the opposite of a strongman leader. He was saying, you know, put individualism aside, let's talk about the greater good. Different rhetoric that we're hearing.
No, indeed, and phenomenally popular in Ireland. Yeah. As you say, I think he's got the biggest mandate of any re-elected president in the history of the country. And, you know, Ireland's not a big place, but it is also reflective that what we've just been talking about, the strong men of the world, is not being reflected everywhere. In fact, there are large parts of the world in which you look at Canada, for example, you know, that liberal old order is still pretty strong.
All right. We have a lot more coming up for you on the program on Raw Politics as the U.S. mourns a deadly attack at a Pittsburgh synagogue. We've been following that story. We look at reports of rising anti-Semitism in Europe. Also, best laid plans. What is a new UK budget really meaning amid so much Brexit uncertainty? Don't go away. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Mourners gathered in Pittsburgh and throughout the world at the weekend to pay tribute to the victims of the worst anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. On Saturday, a heavily armed man shot dead 11 worshippers and injured 6 others during a service in the True of Life synagogue. The gunman later told police he, quote, just wanted to kill Jews, end quote. World leaders, including the Pope, condemned the attack, while local Jewish leaders warned that anti-Semitism is not a thing of the past or chapter in the history books. It is a very real threat. Now, that attack in Pittsburgh has highlighted the rise of anti-Semitic incidents here in Europe as well. The European Commission's coordinator for combating anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schnurbein, has warned that, quote, anti-Semitism is on the rise all across Europe. It is a sign that something is going wrong with society, end quote. In the UK, 2018 has seen the second highest number of anti-Semitic incidents ever recorded in the January to June period. In France, 16,000 Jews have emigrated in the last 3 years. Mass protests were sparked in Paris after 2 elderly Jewish women were murdered in their homes within a year of one another. 2/3 of Germany's Jews, when answering a 2017 survey, said they don't feel themselves to be part of German society. Authoritarian leaders in Eastern Europe are also widely viewed as fueling anti-Semitic rhetoric. Hungary's Viktor Orban has spearheaded a campaign to demonize Hungarian Jewish philanthropist George Soros. And joining me in the studio to take stock of anti-Semitism in Europe, we have our political editor still with us, Darren McCaffrey, Esther Zalan from the EU Observer, and joining us for this panel is Michael Sieveking, who's Deputy Director of the American Jewish Community. I'll start with you, Michael. What is the feeling among the Jewish communities in Europe about anti-Semitism?
Well, the feeling is one of outrage at the events that occurred just in Pittsburgh, and we as an American organization are here to be in touch with our friends in the Jewish communities. Sorry.
No, go ahead. But do you feel that there is a rise indeed?
Yes, absolutely. There has been in recent years a rise in anti-Semitism throughout Europe. Since 2012, there have been 14 Jews murdered because they were Jews. And we've seen an increase of attacks targeting Jewish facilities, and that's.
And what is the sense? Why? What is the sense from the Jewish perspective that this is happening? Why is this happening?
Well, there are various reasons and various origins of anti-Semitism, and we have seen in the United States that it came from a far-right nationalist, white supremacist, while here in Europe, on the ground, we observed that all fatal murderous attacks on Jewish facilities were all motivated by jihadist radical Islamists. So we have to analyze very closely the origins and the different nature of the attacks. You might say that the Brussels attack in 2014 was the 9/11 of the Brussels, or rather the Jewish community here in Belgium, and we're still feeling the reverberations till today.
Right, and if you look to Hungary, we're hearing anti-Semitic rhetoric coming from Viktor Orban himself.
Yeah,
what is behind that?
That's a fascinating phenomenon, I think, because he says he has zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, yet one of the major campaigns that the government is financing is claiming without any evidence that George Soros, a US billionaire who's of Hungarian Jewish origins, is bringing millions of migrants into Europe and therefore threatening European and Christian identity. So there are very not so subtle anti-Semitic overtones in that. But I think what's fascinating is that the Israeli government is supporting
they're cozying up together, indeed.
Prime Minister
and I think,
Orban.
And what's interesting to point out to what Michael was saying is that the different nature, like before it was probably rooted in a feeling of the supreme race, but now we're talking about politics, maybe the Arab-Israeli conflict spilling into domestic issues.
Yeah,
like
and I think also
anti-Semitism.
we're in an era of identity politics, and it's, anti-Semitism is on the rise, but racism in general is on the rise throughout Europe, and that's reflective of the fact that people and leaders are pointing out differences, and we're in this identity politics era. And so clearly, for some vexed issues like the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it is the chance to stoke up that sense of identity and that sense of difference. And that is something that Europe is struggling with, and it is something that Europe's leaders are struggling with because they're not properly dealing with it.
Indeed.
Either they're potentially stoking it up or they're not combating it as a serious issue.
Indeed, it is a problem that the EU is recognizing. We have the EU coordinator on combating anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schnurbein. She's joining us now from Heidelberg in Germany. Katharina, it's very good to have you with us. All right, how big of a problem is this in Europe and what's driving it?
We have seen a tremendous increase not only of incidents, but also of the fear that is among the Jewish community with regards to the threats they perceived. And I think that is the important issue. Do Jews still see a future for themselves here in Europe? And when we see the numbers of Jews that have left Europe, and also the incidents that when they are recorded correctly have gone up, I think that is of great concern to all of us, because we have always seen in the past in Europe, when anti-Semitism is on the rise, it's not only bad for the Jewish community, it's bad for Europe as a whole. And therefore, at the European Commission, we have taken different measures to counter anti-Semitism in different forms. We have endorsed a definition that has been adopted also by the European Parliament that points at the different forms of anti-Semitism that Mr. Sieveking has been referring to, and that therefore gives a good basis for public debate, because indeed it all starts with the recognition that it is a problem, and that on all levels, so from the European level, the national level, the local level, the schoolmasters, law enforcement authorities, we have to tackle this problem and this poison in our own environment.
All right, just very quickly, a yes or no. Do you think this trend is set to continue?
Unfortunately, at the moment it is, because Jews are being perceived still, after centuries of having been here, as the other. And when there is a general increase, as was said already, against the other in forms of racism in general, unfortunately it reflects also on the Jews.
All right, thank you very much for that, Katharina von Schnurbein, joining us from Heidelberg there, Germany, EU coordinator on combating anti-Semitism. All right, bring it back to the panel. Michael, do you feel that the Jewish community feel that Europe is no longer a safe place to be living in this day and age?
I would say that if we look at the events and the facts following the radical attacks on the Jewish facilities here in Europe, we have seen, just as Katarina just said, that the numbers of Jews leaving Europe to Israel, to the nation-state of the Jewish people, or to the United States demonstrate clearly that, for example, in France in the year 2015, in the first half year, there were 7,000. It was a stark increase. So, in a sense, it is a thing through which to look at the rise of anti-Semitism.
I want to bring Darren, because we were talking about, before the show, talking about the UK, because we have a lot of talk of anti-Semitism with regard to Jeremy Corbyn's party.
And there's almost, I think, 100 attacks nearly a month.
And the way they say, you know, there's a difference between anti-Semitism, racism, and criticizing a foreign policy. I mean, you have your views on that.
The problem is that, yes, of course, you know, it is the responsibility, I would almost say, of British politicians, and indeed of any politician, to have a view on the actions of different states across the world. And clearly the Labour leadership, as it currently is very critical of the state of Israel, and that is perfectly within the right. The problem is that they have allowed those lines then to be blurred. Where that then steps into the realm of being critical of Judaism, and allowing, which many would accuse Jeremy Corbyn of doing, allowing anti-Semitism as part of that overall wider political narrative to grow up, and that he has not done enough to slap that down and to make it clear, you know, that there is a big distinction between the criticism of Israel as a state and indeed its actions, and not allowing that to stray into, you know, the dark, very poisonous world of anti-Semitism.
I think that's an important point,
quickly,
but also, I mean, anti-Semitism has been around before. I think what really has changed is that political leaders are suggesting or saying out loud that this is okay, and it's no longer a taboo.
I think the important thing is recognizing what the issues are, then moving forward. All right, a very sensitive issue indeed. But now let's move on to one of our other stories in today's Power Play, because it features 4 really unlikely political bedfellows. Let's take a look. As the 7-year Syrian civil war enters its final stages, 4 of Europe's biggest leaders met in Istanbul this weekend for peace talks. They called for the creation of a committee tasked with drafting a post-war constitution and said that a fragile ceasefire in the last rebel-held stronghold of Idlib must be preserved. But the quartet carefully sidestepped the thorny issue of Bashar al-Assad's future. And aside from the talks, this is the moment that got everyone talking. Macron and Merkel lining up to hold hands with their strongmen neighbors Putin and Erdogan. No words exchanged, but you could say their body language spoke volumes. That was really awkward.
Yeah, yes. Angela Merkel couldn't look more uncomfortable to be there, and Vladimir Putin had a smile from... I don't know who choreographs these things, but that was very odd.
Macron seemed very unhappy too that he needs to hold hands with Erdogan.
Well, they're very, very different leaders, and they're very different. I do not
funny to see them in the same...
it is, and of course, Syria is an important issue, and you have to deal with the regional powers and the players, clearly, that have been in the Syrian conflict. But I'm not entirely sure it's a good look for Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel to be holding the hands of Vladimir Putin and
on a serious note,
there's no solution
on a serious note, though, let's hope that could be a good ground for the Syrian conflict. Anyway, more after the break on Raw Politics. Call it the best case Brexit budget. Theresa May's government unveils its spending plans 5 months before the deadline for the UK to leave Europe. Don't go away. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now it's budget day in the UK, exactly 5 months before Britain leaves the EU. All eyes are on this man, Chancellor Philip Hammond, and his famous red briefcase. Before him, an unenviable task, planning the financial future of his country, with so much of that resting on securing a Brexit deal with Brussels. Now, ahead of today's speech, he said that a no-deal outcome could mean an emergency budget and more austerity, and that's at odds with Theresa May, who said austerity was over. And we did just hear from him some lines coming in. He had said that austerity is coming to an end. That is his message, and that there will be increased spending in the event of a no-deal Brexit. So that's the plan. Now, joining me, our political editor here at Euronews, Darren McCaffrey, still with us. Also joining us on this panel is Dharmendra Kanani. He's Director of Strategy at Friends of Europe. And back with us, Bruno Waterfield, the Brussels correspondent for The Times. All right, we're looking, so Philip Hammond saying that austerity is coming to an end. Anything he has to say today, is it even meaningful in the fact that we don't even know what's happening to Brexit?
In many ways, it's a faux budget. That briefcase is very, very kind of weak and not very strong. The foundations on which this budget is made is uncertain, wrapped in politics. We don't know what the DUP are going to do. We don't know actually whether the forecasts will work out. In effect, what he should have done is present two options, two scenarios for the budget. One which is post-Brexit and one which was with no Brexit. Actually, then giving people a proper opportunity to understand whether actually this makes sense. He's caught in a rock and hard place. On the one hand, does he spend more and tax more, or does he borrow more and spend more? Both of those are not compatible.
And Bruno, he says austerity has ended. Do you believe him?
Look, it depends how you measure it. Is it increasing public spending? Is it restoring public spending to 2010 level? I mean, it's one of those movable feasts for politicians that sounds good. I think the substance behind the point is if there is a no-deal scenario, that means a big shift in Britain's economic strategy. It means, for example, huge fiscal spending to support industry. Think about those assurances that were given to Nissan up in the northeast of Britain to keep their there. So that's really what he was talking about. It's also a bit of a warning to the EU, actually, because Britain has very low levels of what's called state aid, i.e. subsidies to industry in European terms. In a no-deal scenario, that changes, and that will change in Europe as well, because we will see a trend of even beggar thy neighbour in terms of subsidies for industry. And I think that's what he's warning. He's saying that in the event of no deal, that means Britain will have a very, very different economic strategy. So I think in that sense, it makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, the two telling things are not that actually the Prime Minister and the Chancellor in Britain seem at odds with each other about whether the spending commitments will be in place in a no-deal Brexit, is that Philip Hammond admitted yesterday that there would be an emergency budget in the event of no deal because the finances will change and Britain's economic outlook, at least in the immediate future, would change. I think the interesting thing about austerity is that what the Conservative Party realised during the last election is that they had not focused enough on the domestic agenda, that austerity had hurt them politically, and this attempt, whether it's true or not, to dress up that austerity is at an end, it is one eye on the fact that we're in a very politically unstable world in which election could happen at any stage, and they want to address that point.
But even the austerity point is really a lie, because, the Institute of Fiscal Studies have done an analysis that actually to keep it at this level and actually to reduce...
You said it's a lie.
Absolutely, because it needs £19 billion a year. That's a penny on every tax lever from income to VAT that he'll have to impose. if he's going to end austerity in some respects, not in full respects, because that's still going to leave the wide net of social security, which they can't afford, which is 7 billion a year. So actually the numbers don't add up, and that's why it's a faux budget. And actually we're much better to set out something which is a series of options that Parliament could really legitimately vote on.
And so we do have ultimately the 50 pence piece. They're going to introduce
Brexit. It's going to be. Tomorrow it could be a whole different story,
Absolutely.
isn't it? All right, let's look at tonight's raw moment. And as Angela Merkel announces that she'll stand out in 2021, it's a look back at some highlights from her political career. Let's take a look. That's Angela Merkel then and now. All right, one word each. What is Angela Merkel's legacy, Bruno?
Failure.
The last statesman of Europe.
All right.
And I'd say longevity. There's not many leaders who are in that position at the top of their game for so long.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll end the show here. Thank you for watching us. We'd like to hear what you're talking about. Get in touch at Tessa Ercilia or at Euronews and use the hashtag #RawPolitics. See you tomorrow.